Nominations are now in order for judges of the General District Court. The clerk will report a resolution.
House Resolution 619, nominating persons to be elected to General District Court judgeships. And Mr. Speaker, I would draw the body's attention to a modification that lines 12 and 13 have been stricken.
The gentlewoman from Richmond, Delegate McClellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the resolution.
The gentlewoman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I know the hour is late, but I feel like something important is going to happen tonight. There is a candidate who is the unanimous choice of the Richmond delegation for the 13th Judicial District, Tracy Thorne-Begland. This is a candidate who went through the vetting process, who came before the Courts of Justice Committee with his questionnaire, with delegation standing behind him, who the Courts Committee had the opportunity to ask questions, asked a few, who was certified by the Courts Committee, and yet now, a few days before he was to be voted on, questions have been raised about his character, his record, and his qualifications. If you ask any member of the bar or the criminal justice system, except maybe defendants, judges, the police, they will tell you that Tracy is the kind of qualified, hardworking, dedicated person who should be on the bench. He's one of the best prosecutors in the state. But questions have been raised about his military record, what he may or may not have done 20 years ago. What he did not do 20 years ago was violate the Uniform Code of Military Justice. What he did do 20 years ago was tell the truth. Tracy was willing to fight and die for his country, but he was not willing to lie for the privilege and lie about who he was. Tracy was honorably discharged from the military for telling the truth. But when Tracy was discharged from the military, he was awarded a Navy Achievement Medal because he showed up every day, gave his job and his country all that he had, even though he knew that by telling the truth, he could lose his job. But his service was so appreciated that his boss nominated him for a Medal for Outstanding Service, which was awarded by the United States Navy. But 20 years later, after he told the truth, and the military and the country have moved on from a question of whether you can be discriminated against for being who you are, some people are still hung up on it. Since leaving the military, Tracy went to law school and has spent the past 15 years becoming one of the best prosecutors in the city. Now, he's been criticized for disagreeing with, publicly, the Attorney General, Attorney General Cuccinelli, on whether or not Virginia universities can discriminate. But you know who else disagreed with the Attorney General on that? Governor McDonald. And if disagreeing with the Attorney General publicly about an issue of discrimination or any other issue disqualifies someone from the bench, I dare say many of the people who have been appointed throughout history and probably today would not be appointed. We have two people we're going to vote for today who spent a career in a different kind of service in this body, taking positions publicly on all kinds of issues. Some would say they were advocates. When Tracy wrote to Chairman Albo, or the gentleman from Fairfax and the gentleman from Richmond, sending in his resume and questionnaire, he outlined his judicial philosophy. And he said, "I believe the distinction between the role of a prosecutor and that of a district judge is well illustrated by an incident between two great jurists, Oliver Wendell Holmes and Learned Hand. It is said that one day, as the two colleagues were parting following a luncheon, Judge Hand called out to Justice Holmes, 'Do justice, Mr. Holmes, do justice.' And Justice Holmes stopped, turned, and replied to Judge Hand, 'That is not my job. My job is to apply the law.' Chief Justice Roberts describes the role of a judge as an umpire. Judges don't make the rules. Like umpires, they enforce them. The role of a judge is a limited one. It is not to present a case for a party. It is to call balls and strikes by applying the law. There may be circumstances that I will face as a judge where I may disagree with existing statutes or interpretations of those statutes by a higher authority. Nonetheless, my decisions will be guided by and faithful to the constitutions, the law, and case authority of the Commonwealth and the United States. I understand my role as a district court judge will be to apply the law." Today, Governor McDonald said we should look at a judicial candidate's qualifications and issues of who they are, be it race, sex, or sexual orientation, should not matter. I agree with the governor on that. The Richmond delegation was unanimous behind Tracy when his name was first put forward, and now, because we think he is the best qualified candidate to be on the General District Court. And yet there are some who say he's not qualified simply because he told the truth about who he was, which many people believe was the right thing to do. He has been vindicated that that was the right thing to do. He's not going to be a judicial activist on the bench. He will apply the law to the facts before him. And I hope that fear or bigotry or an ignorance of the facts or of the person will not cloud anybody's judgment today. We know Tracy in the city of Richmond and our delegation. We have seen him come to work every day and do what is in the best interest of the criminal justice system for the city. We know he will do the same on the General District Court. Do not say to him, 20 years after he lost one job because he told the truth, that now he's not qualified for another simply because of that. And for that, I really hope that you will support this appointment. Thank you.
The gentleman from Richmond City, Mr. LaPazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Rise to speak to the resolution.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would concur with the gentlelady from the city. Tracy Thorne-Begland has been a prosecutor in the city for 12 years. I prosecuted with him for a period of time. I think that if you go through his background and his resume, which I know we all have had the opportunity to do, that it is without question that he is extremely qualified. The city of Richmond, I said this earlier today, the city of Richmond has, I think if you counted the number of homicides, aggravated assaults, and rapes that are prosecuted in the city of Richmond, that it would probably add up to the rest of the state's prosecutions combined. And this man has been in charge for the last 3 years, the chief deputy of that office. He's eminently qualified. There are, for 12 years, he's been prosecuting extremely serious crimes. There are, and I can go through the litany, you've all seen the list of, this is just things that he put together off of the top of his head this weekend. But it's case after case after case of men and women that are in jail right now. They're in the Department of Corrections for committing serious and heinous crimes against citizens of the Commonwealth. And many of them have gotten life sentences, 43-year sentences. He's been doing his job, and he's been doing it well. He has been protecting us from criminals. As we're sitting here right now, we got here safely today. One of us could have been the victim of some crime for one of these people that would be walking the street, but for the fact that he put them away. And I would say to you that I have known this man for a very long time, and I believe that he absolutely will carry out the duties of this office in a dignified way and in a correct way. One last thing I want to point out to you: the general district courts in the Commonwealth of Virginia are courts that are like a night court. They deal with issues of, did John smack Mary? Did someone trespass on someone's property? Did someone spray paint someone's home or property? These are the kind of issues that are dealt with in these courts, and the type of issues, the social issues, and those kind of things that would touch upon someone's constitutional interpretations, they don't go before these courts. I'm in a general district court every day. They just don't. And he's indicated that if anything like that came up, he would recuse himself. The man is eminently qualified, and I'm asking you to vote in favor of him being on the general district bench in our city.
Gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Marshall.
Speaking of the resolution, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, enlistment into the military in the late 1980s and early 1990s required everybody to sign a statement. And that statement asked the question as to your personal sexual behavior. Were you a homosexual? Now, this had been the policy not from the Vietnam War, the Korean War, World War II, World War I, but back to George Washington. In different variations, the prohibition on certain behavior excluded people from the military. In order to get into the military, Mr. Tracy Thorne-Begland would have had to sign a statement, "No, I am not." Yet, when you read the biographical statement in the Richmond University alumni, he indicated he talked about he was struggling with the secret of his sexual orientation. Now, didn't say he was struggling with an ambiguity. It was the secret of his sexual orientation. Now, you can have that in this country, and you're not going to be chased down on the streets. But when you answer a question that is false on an application, that calls some things into question. Moreover, he had to take an oath of office, and that oath of office indicates that you would obey the lawful orders of superiors, that you would abide by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and that furthermore, there were 16 prohibited things that you could not do if you were under these circumstances. One of them was to participate in any radio, television, or other program or group discussion as an advocate for or against a partisan political party, candidate, or cause. The applicant or the nominee went on national television, Nightline, in uniform, and announced his personal behavior. That was in direct violation of the application, of the oath of office, and of this right here. So it wasn't for telling the truth that there's a problem here. There's a question as to whether or not the oath of office is seriously taken. Moreover, we have in the Virginia Constitution a clear definition of marriage. And you are to take an oath to uphold and defend this Constitution. And when you state that you're in a relationship that is a contradiction with that, I don't see how you can be a judge. For example, if somebody were a polygamist, you could not take an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution because your actions would be in violation of that. Moreover, in the short biography that was passed out to members, at least of the Republican caucus, I note a number of omissions. Omitted was Thorne versus U.S. Department of Defense, in which his claim that he had a First Amendment right to this kind of behavior and actions related to it was rejected. Moreover, the other activities which were not mentioned include NBC Nightline, May 3rd, 1993, Richmond Times letter to the editor, May 26th, WAVA Television, 9/21/11, RVA News. If you want to be an advocate, that's one thing, and you have a First Amendment right and privilege to do it. But having already taken an oath and violated it, why would it be any different now, especially if one has announced that your own behavior is in violation or in contradiction to the Constitution, that we should accept that? Now, the gentleman apparently is doing a good job as a prosecutor, and that's fine. But members in here who took an oath of office to defend this Constitution, and especially if you say you supported the marriage amendment, your judgment will be called into question if you place into office one whose life and behavior is at variance with that. So the people will judge us. It's not just us judging whether or not the applicant has good judicial behavior or good judgment. And I would suggest to you that had he left the military and pursued the cause, the case would be somewhat different. But we are not in the habit of appointing people which would be called judicial activists in Virginia, whether you're from the liberal side of the fence or the conservative side of the fence. It's not what we do. And so I would urge a rejection of the application.
Gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Lincolnfelter.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the resolution.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the hour is very late, and I can tell by looking at our colleagues, we're all very exhausted. But there are some things that need to be said, and I would like to focus my remarks on the issue of judgment. I'm going to head down the road to Lexington tonight, if we ever get out of here, for my son's graduation, and tomorrow a good many of these young men and women will take an oath similar to the oath I took some 35 years ago on the plains at VMI. This is what they'll say. I solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservations, this is important, or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties, underline duties, duties of the office upon which I am about to enter, so help me God. It is duty that is the focus of my remarks. And for a military officer, it's a tough, tough thing. There were times in my 28 years in the service where my chain of command, and indeed sometimes my commander-in-chief, would issue orders and directives that I did not agree with. And in some cases, I found morally repugnant. Duty. It was my duty to follow the orders and the directives and the regulations and the policy of my leaders. We in the military surrender certain rights all of us as civilians take for granted every day. One of them is the First Amendment. We don't get to say what we want to say anytime we want to say it, and for whatever reason might come to mind that we will say it. We must subordinate that, even if we believe in our minds it is the, quote, truth, unquote. We are required to follow the regulations, directives, and policies of our leaders. And when we find it, or when we find ourselves in a place we can no longer do that, then we resign our station, we hang up our uniform, we put on our civilian garb, and we speak our mind. That is what we do. In the directives that guide the military, the bottom line is this. While serving on active duty, certain political activities and types of speech are prohibited. Service members must refrain from participating in the activity while in uniform or wearing the official insignia that may be prejudicial to the performance of military government duties, or is likely to bring discredit on the armed forces. In addition, some activities that could be viewed as associating the armed forces directly or indirectly with partisan political causes or candidates. There are some specifics, a gentleman from Prince William alluded to one, that are specifically prohibited of us in uniform. And one of them that is specifically prohibited is participation in any radio, television, or other program or group discussion as an advocate for or against a partisan party, political party, comma, candidate, comma, or cause. Very clear. It is, ladies and gentlemen of this honorable body, the duty of an officer to follow those directives. And when an officer elects of his or her own volition to set that duty aside, however well intended and however deeply held. They are breaking their duty, and in doing so, exercising bad judgment, which brings me to this. For me, this is a case of bad judgment. And when in fact people have bad judgment, it causes me to question whether they should be judges. And so for me, it's not about fear and bigotry and ignorance and so forth. It is very definitely about duty. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry that we're at this place. It's a hard thing to do, I know. But for this old soldier, these things matter.
The gentleman from Stafford, Mr. Dudenhofer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the nomination.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, sir. I'd like to read from an op-ed that I found on the internet earlier this afternoon. Inserting partisan politics into our military is dangerous. Our nation's military cannot be divided into political factions where loyalty is based on whether service members agree with the political views of the Commander-in-Chief. As the U.S. Supreme Court noted when withholding restrictions on partisan politics in the military, we live under, quote, the American constitutional tradition of a politically neutral military establishment under civil control, close quote. There should be zero tolerance by the military for any partisan politicking by active duty service members or men or women. This is not only, quote, prejudicial to good order and discipline, close quotes, but could lead to the loss of lives. We already have one dysfunctional institution marred by partisan infighting, the U.S. Congress. We can't afford another. You might think that that op-ed was written for this case back in the 1990s. Well, it wasn't. It was written on April the 27th and posted on the CNN opinion page, written by a very well-known liberal activist and columnist for CNN. This was written because in response to a young Marine sergeant whose offense was he posted on a Facebook page 9 words that were disparaging to his Commander-in-Chief. That Marine was given a less than honorable discharge. I would say that that was rather harsh, but he deserved what he got. And there's a lot of people might not agree with me. I would say based on what happened there, that the gentleman who was being nominated got off awful easy back in the 90s when the military wanted this whole issue to go away. And therefore, they were easy about what they decided to give to this gentleman. I served for 30 years in the uniform, and for the last 8 years working for the Department of Defense. And that's more years than some members of this chamber have been alive. And I understand that it's hard, unless you've served in the uniform and have served around the world and seen the conditions that we don't have to live in, that have fought wars so that we can sit here today and make the judgments and make these free speech proclamations that we make on a daily basis. I can tell you without a doubt that without those rules and the laws that those men and women live up to, we would not be sitting here today. Good order and discipline. These rules weren't invented in the last 10, 20, 30 years. These are tried and true laws that have evolved over thousands of years of warfare. And if you haven't served, I'm sorry, this may be a foreign concept to you. When I found that this gentleman was the record from him, and I've heard good things about him, Mr. Lapasi has made a tremendous appeal for his quote-unquote qualifications. And I don't deny that he's a great prosecutor. But what I will tell you is he made choices which disqualify him, in my mind, from being a judge who should be above repute. And I would say that at a time when he swore an oath of allegiance and he subjected himself to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and he gave up most of his First Amendment free speech rights, that's right, he gave them up when he swore, I'm not sure and can have no confidence that at a time of his choosing, he will opt to also take a position that is against the laws of this Commonwealth and our country. And therefore, I will not be voting for his nomination to a judgeship. And I request my colleagues to follow the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Enrico, Mr. Morrissey.
The gentleman from Prince William County, Delegate Lingenfelter, you rise and yield for a question.
The gentleman from Prince William yield to a question.
I will yield.
The gentleman yields.
I would ask the gentleman that he spoke during his remarks against the nominee about, used the word duty, and suggested that the nominee showed a lack of that. I would ask the gentleman the following. Is it possible for a naval officer who does not fulfill his duty or show his duty to his country to be awarded a Naval Achievement Medal of Honor on the very day that he is discharged from the armed services? Is that even possible?
Mr. Speaker, I would say it certainly is possible, but it doesn't at all negate anything that I said. The truth of the matter is, people can be of good spirit. They can be pleasant. They can, in just about every regard, do their job. But when they take the extraordinary measure of speaking against their chain of command and speaking against the official policy of their commander-in-chief, they have stepped outside of what is acceptable. And I would point out to the gentleman that I don't think the Navy treated this lightly when they discharged him not once, but twice. And I do think, quite frankly, they were being generous with him, as the gentleman from Stafford pointed out in his remarks.
Would the gentleman yield for another question, Mr. Speaker?
For the gentleman yield for another question.
I will yield.
Gentleman yields.
Can the gentleman point to one instance when the nominee took an oath to obey the Constitution of the United States, both as a naval officer and the oath to support the Constitution of the United States and the Commonwealth of Virginia 3 times as an assistant Commonwealth attorney? Can the gentleman point to one instance where he violated that oath?
I would respond to the gentleman that he should refer himself to my previous remarks, and that is what I believe about this case.
Would the gentleman yield for another question?
The gentleman yield for another question.
Final question, as the hour is very late.
Gentleman yields.
Would the gentleman agree that the gentleman from Prince William County's comment that he appeared in uniform while he exercised his First Amendment rights was inaccurate, and that, in fact, the nominee never, ever appeared in uniform when he expressed his First Amendment rights and discussed his sexual orientation?
Mr. Speaker, I would allow the gentleman to respond to his own questions.
Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Marshall.
I will respond that I saw an NBC Tom Brokaw newsreel from 1993 in which Senator Nunn was conducting an inquiry down in Tidewater area, And unless there was some rejuxtaposition of individuals, somebody identified as Mr. Tracy-Begland was indeed testifying before Senator Nunn. So while it may not have been on Nightline, I saw it the past 2 days, and I just would refer the gentleman to that, and I do have a date for that, and I found it on the internet, and I would just urge the gentleman to look at that.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman from Prince William County yield for a question?
Will the gentleman from Prince William yield to a question?
This gentleman?
Yes.
Yes.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the gentleman, did he not say in a recent report or interview to the Washington Post, quote, because the nominee has a same-sex partner, he should not be allowed on the bench? Did the gentleman say that is the reason why he was not qualified?
We have a marriage amendment which says that marriage is only between one man and one woman. And I would stress to the gentleman that if a polygamist came and was an otherwise crackerjack prosecuting attorney, that behavior, action, set of relations would disqualify such an individual from nomination because your life would be a contradiction to the Constitution that you swear to uphold and defend. So that's why I think it's a disqualifying factor. I trust the gentleman disagrees with me, but that's my explanation.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for another question?
Will the gentleman from Prince William yield to a question?
At 12:27, yes.
Gentleman yields.
Can the gentleman tell this body in the last 12 years how the Mr. Thorne-Begland having a same-sex partner in any single instance showed himself not to be anything less than a stellar prosecutor? Anything that he can point to in the last dozen years?
I haven't chased him around, following him for his activities or his professional competence, but I would just suggest to you right here, the activities suggest a degree of activism, and this is not all, I just put 6 to letters to my colleagues here, that is incompatible with the judicial demeanor. Here, Gay Influence blog, Men of Influence, Gay Influence, RVA News, An Open and Honest Life, biography of Tracy Thorne-Begland, WAVA TV, Tracy Thorne-Begland interviewed on the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, September 21, 2011. Richmond Times, Lies and Deceit Must End in Opposition to Ban on Homosexuals and Military. His case, which I would hope that the gentleman from the 74th District has read, Thorne versus U.S. Department of Defense, the claim that the First Amendment was controlling here, should allow him to remain in the military, was rejected as an unsound constitutional argument. So, and here it is, May 10th, 1993, NBC Nightly News, Sam Nunn, opposition to President Clinton's policy. And I have the YouTube reference here.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for another question?
Will the gentleman yield for another question?
The last question.
Was the gentleman quoted accurately in the Washington Post when he said, quote, Mr. Thorne-Begland has a homosexual agenda that he would try to advance as a criminal judge, close quote?
I didn't say criminal judge because he's not a criminal judge so far as his misdemeanors. That may be accurate, but does the gentleman have an agenda? Someone who belongs to the Board of Equality Virginia, someone who was on the staff, at least if the reports are correct, of the, the National, what's that organization, Human Rights Campaign, someone who engages in these activities consistently, continually, in pursuit of one goal, I would suggest is an activist. So that's my conclusion, and I stand by it. So thank you very much.
Speaking to the nominee, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it must be 3 or 4 weeks ago that the gentleman from Prince William County, Delegate Lingenfelter, suggested that I look at a documentary on Loving, the Loving versus Commonwealth case, where the Virginia Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court ruled that, the Virginia Supreme Court had ruled that somebody who was of African-American descent could not marry somebody who was a Caucasian. And he told me and he suggested, Joe, if you look at that, it'll break your heart. I suggest, Mr. Speaker and ladies and gentlemen of the body, that maybe a year from now, maybe a few years from now, certainly a decade or more, we will look back and we will say that in this 21st century, the suggestion that we as a body did not allow somebody to take the bench because they're gay, and that's really what we're doing, is the same travesty that the Delegate Lingenfelter suggested to me, and I suggest it will be heartbreaking. The gentleman from Prince William County, the former military officer, Delegate Lingenfelter, talked about character and temperament and demeanor and courage and convictions and duty, all of which this gentleman has shown as a naval officer. In fact, he received a distinguished medal on the very day he left that service. But more importantly, our Commonwealth and our country is one of giving people. We value redemption. We think it's noble. And in the last 12 years, you look at what that person has done, and there's not a soul that can say that he hasn't distinguished himself in every aspect of being a prosecutor, to such a degree that members of the criminal bar, the civil bar, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges, when they can comment on it, have said this person would be an excellent jurist. Still, we deny this person an opportunity to serve on the bench because of his sexual orientation. I think if we deny this nominee that ability, we do the Commonwealth and ourselves a disservice. I hope that this body will support Mr. Thorne-Begland as a candidate for the judiciary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak to the resolution.
The gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I look around this chamber tonight, and I look full in the face of people, some of whom have spoken. Colonel L. Scott Lingenfelter, United States Army. Colonel L. Mark Dudenheffer, United States Marine Corps. I don't believe he's in the chamber now, but Commander Chris Stolley. Commander Mark Cole. Oh, there you are. Sorry. I think Lieutenant Commander Rick Morris, Captain Jackson Miller, Sergeant Tim Hugo, and many others who have worn the cloth of our country. And I feel compelled to try to bring this discussion back to what I believe is the essence of the question before the body. And that question is the keeping of one's oath, one's solemn vow to one's nation, one's constitution, one's fellow citizenry, who count on America's military to provide for the common defense. Virginia is home, as you've heard many times, to 830,000 veterans and some 250,000 men and women who currently wear the uniform as active duty and as guardsmen and reservists serving our country and our Commonwealth. They understand this concept of true faith and allegiance, this concept of obedience to the Constitution, this concept of fidelity to the solemn vow that they took to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And while I'm talking about oaths, I would like to make one parenthetical statement that has been eating at me for this and the previous 2 terms or 2 sessions that I have been here, and that is this. What separates the men and women of our nation who wear the uniform and have taken an oath and the men and women who serve in the legislatures and in all the states? And it's this. In this chamber, to sit in these very precious seats that we occupy, we take an oath to support the Constitution. Look at your constitutional oath as prescribed in the Virginia Constitution. It is to support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia. But men and women who choose to wear the uniform of our nation vow to preserve, protect, and defend. And that is a different oath. It is an oath where one vows to lay their life on the line for their fellow man. And it's in this regard that this takes on so much meaning for men and women who have worn the uniform of the country. Our concern is that the nominee chose to violate that solemn, sacred oath of office that called a national service and sacrifice, the uniform that he wore, And therein lies the challenge. It is about an oath, a keeping of a solid and most sacred vow. Those who choose to speak outside the parameters of that oath need to step outside of their significant military responsibilities, and they are significant because the men and women of this country who wear the uniform hold in their hands, their mortal hands, literally the thunderbolts of the nation. And they need to step outside and make their case from without. To do otherwise erodes the military effectiveness and the mission readiness of the United States military. And therein lies the concern. America's Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps is the most lethal the world has ever known and has been the protector of peace for 2.5 centuries. And the important thing to remember is the reason it has done that job so capably and effectively is simply because it is manned, the military services are manned by men and women who keep true faith and allegiance to their oath. I would urge this body to reject the nomination.
The gentleman from Manassas, Mr. Miller.
Mr. Speaker, I rise for motion.
Gentleman may state it.
Move the pending question.
Gentleman moves the pending question. All those in favor of the motion of moving the pending question, signify by saying aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The pending question is moved. Okay. Are there further nominations for General District Court judges?
Mr. Speaker.
Yeah. Gentleman from Shenandoah, Mr. Gilbert.
Parliamentary inquiry.
Gentleman may state it.
The question is on the adoption of the resolution as a whole. Is that correct? And not on any particular individual?
Gentleman is correct. That's where we are at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. The chair has no further nominations. As many as favor the adoption of the resolution will say aye. Those opposed, no. The resolution is agreed to.